The courtroom door swung open, and a wave of tense air rushed in, as though this place was about to witness a real battle. Naomi Carter walked in, her faded blue suit clinging to her slender yet resilient frame. The worn leather briefcase in her hand evoked the image of someone desperately clinging to their last hope. But in her eyes, there was no panic, no hesitation, just a deadly calm, like a storm ready to break. Ahead of her, Judge William Crawford leaned back in his chair, his cold eyes gleaming with contempt. He glanced at her dismissively before breaking into a mocking smile. "Miss Carter, are you defending yourself?" His elongated tone dripped with sarcasm, and the courtroom erupted in soft chuckles. At the plaintiff's table, Attorney Oliver Remington smirked, casually adjusting his Rolex as if the woman standing before him were of no consequence. But when Naomi set the briefcase down, opened a stack of documents, and calmly looked up, the room suddenly grew unnervingly quiet. There was something about her that made Remington's smile falter for a brief moment. Who did they think she was? Some weakling walking in here to accept defeat? But what no one knew was that Naomi wasn't just a lone woman fighting an unjust lawsuit. She held a secret, a truth that, when revealed, would leave the entire courtroom stunned. And when that moment came, no one would dare smile again. Who was she really? How could an unknown woman silence the entire courtroom with just a look? And what was about to unfold that would make the judge completely change his attitude? Keep your eyes on the screen because this story will have you questioning everything you thought you knew. If you love stories full of drama and unexpected twists like this, make sure to hit subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our future stories. The courtroom felt like a grand stage where every glance, every word, contributed to a drama already scripted. The rows of seats behind were packed, from young lawyers to curious onlookers, all gathered to witness what they believed would be nothing short of a humiliating defeat for the defendant. None of them expected a reversal, nor a trial full of surprises. To them, it was just another ordinary morning where a woman, armed with nothing but her stubbornness, was attempting to fight against a system she had no chance of defeating. Naomi Carter entered, each step deliberate yet confident. She wore an old blue suit, the collar slightly frayed. Her simple but clean low-heeled shoes clicked softly as she walked. No expensive jewelry, no sleek briefcase like the other lawyers, just an old leather bag that she gripped tightly, as if it contained her entire hope for the trial. But what drew the attention was not her humble appearance, but her eyes. Deep, sharp eyes devoid of fear, free of hesitation, holding only an unyielding determination as cold and firm as stone. At the front, Judge William Crawford sat regally behind his high podium. His cold gray eyes swept over Naomi in a flash, conveying a clear sense of disdain. He didn't speak right away. Instead, leaning back, his fingers slowly tapped a rhythm on the desk, as if assessing how long this farce would drag on before he'd be forced to end it. To Crawford, this was not a trial worth his time. It was just a minor procedure, a lawsuit with nothing special except that a woman dared to stand alone before the court without any lawyer by her side. Did she really think she would accomplish something here? Whispers from behind grew louder. Some people lowered their heads, murmuring to each other. A few young lawyers sneered, as though they had just seen a fool trying to swim against a colossal wave. Naomi didn't need to turn around to know what they were saying. She had heard those words all her life. Does she really think she can win? One man whispered to his neighbor. No lawyer, no chance. A woman's voice replied, certain of the outcome. At the plaintiff's table, Oliver Remington leaned back in his chair, his fingers casually gliding over his shiny Rolex watch. He had sat here hundreds of times before, watching countless people like Naomi walk into the courtroom with the faint hope that justice might somehow be on their side. And then he watched them fall. It was always the same. This system wasn't made for people like her. He let out a half smile, tilted his head as he watched Naomi, almost as if assessing how long she would drag out her own despair. Plaintiff, are you ready to present your case? Judge Crawford's voice rang out, firm yet laced with laziness, as though he already knew the outcome and simply wanted to rush through the process. Remington nodded, but just as he was about to rise, Naomi placed her briefcase on the table. A small gesture, but it caused the room to fall into an odd, sudden silence. She opened the briefcase, turning the pages of her documents with a calmness that bordered on unsettling. Then, when she looked up, her eyes locked with Remington's. There was something in the way she looked at him that made his smile falter for a moment. The room grew quieter than usual, as if everyone suddenly sensed an unexpected shift. Something was off. This woman was not the fragile figure they had all assumed her to be. And in that instant, Oliver Remington felt something he hadn't anticipated: unease. Judge William Crawford slowly adjusted his glasses, his cold gaze sweeping over the woman standing at the defendant's podium. He tapped his fingers lightly on the desk, creating a rhythmic, deliberate sound that was full of hidden meaning. A faint smile appeared on his lips before he leaned forward, his voice slow and heavy, as if savoring a joke that only he understood. "So, Miss Carter has decided to represent herself?" His words acted like a spark, and instantly, a soft chuckle echoed from the rows behind. A few lawyers exchanged knowing glances, while others whispered to one another as if they had just heard the most absurd thing of the day. Naomi didn't react. She didn't appear embarrassed, flustered, or even the slightest bit angry. She simply stood there, shoulders straight, her face without the slightest flicker of emotion. Then she gently nodded. Crawford squinted, clearly irritated by Naomi's calm demeanor. He was used to seeing defendants nervous, scared, sometimes trembling before him, but she had no reaction at all, not the one he had expected. His gaze drifted over to the plaintiff's table, where Oliver Remington was watching with a mix of amusement and disdain. Remington raised an eyebrow, as if signaling that this trial wouldn't last long. These two men were too familiar with each other, and in that brief moment, it seemed as if they silently agreed that Naomi Carter was just a stubborn woman who would be crushed in under an hour. But Naomi did not falter. She had prepared for this moment for a long time. She could feel the eyes of those waiting for her to make a mistake, eager for any sign of worry to cling to, but she wouldn't give them the chance. What they didn't know was that she hadn't entered this courtroom with empty hands. She had studied, prepared, and gathered everything necessary, not just to stand her ground, but to shake the very foundations of these arrogant men. Finally, Remington spoke, his voice warm, yet unmistakably smug. "Your Honor, if the defendant is ready, we can proceed immediately. I believe this trial won't take up much of your time." Crawford chuckled softly and nodded in agreement. "Very well, Mr. Remington. I hope so." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her cold gaze sweeping over the two men who were so confident in their victory. How many times had she seen arrogance like this? How many times had she witnessed people like them, believing that power and status allowed them to decide who the loser would be even before the trial had begun? They thought of her as weak prey entering the domain of predators. But predators often have a fatal flaw: complacency. And Naomi Carter was waiting for the exact moment to strike back. Oliver Remington stepped forward, the sound of his polished leather shoes slicing through the silence like a predator on the hunt. His every movement exuded confidence, his posture straight and commanding as he adjusted his expensive tie with a practiced hand. Standing before the judge and the entire courtroom, he began to speak in a voice as smooth as velvet, yet laced with an undeniable air of authority. "Your Honor, this case is truly straightforward. I won't take up too much of the court's precious time." A half-smile crept across his face, the kind of smile that suggested he had already won, that this was just another step in a process he was all too familiar with. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers, flipping through them at a leisurely pace. His movements were casual, almost bored, as if this were nothing more than a formality. "My client, Mr. Charles Whitmore, is the rightful and legal owner of this property. Here are all the documents, ownership certificates, the sales contract, and all other related materials. The defendant, Miss Naomi Carter, has no legal paperwork to show any claim to this property. Your Honor, I trust you can see how clear-cut this case is." Judge William Crawford leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him. He nodded slightly with every word that Remington spoke, his cold, calculating eyes scanning the documents with a detached air, as though this case were already settled in his mind. He didn't even glance at Naomi as he gave her a dismissive look, just a brief, cursory sweep that made it clear she was nothing more than an insignificant nuisance. To Crawford, this was just another routine trial, another easy victory for the powerful, a pointless exercise where Naomi Carter would soon realize her futile position. He believed with unshakable certainty that the game was already over. The room fell into a deathly quiet. The seasoned lawyers, the curious onlookers, and even the clerks at the back of the courtroom had seen this story unfold hundreds of times before. The rich and powerful had the means to crush those with nothing but hope. Naomi's presence here was just a reminder of how easily the weak were trampled underfoot by a system that favored wealth and status. Someone in the back of the room chuckled softly, mockingly, as though Naomi wasn't even worthy of a fair fight. But then, in a moment that seemed to stretch the very fabric of time, Naomi Carter stood up. There was no rush in her movements. She didn't stumble or falter. Her body was steady, her gaze unwavering, her every step deliberate as she slowly rose from her seat. There was no hint of fear or hesitation in her expression as she walked toward the podium. The air seemed to change. The tension in the room grew thick, the weight of every eye now resting on her. She reached into her briefcase, her hands moving with purpose. She flipped through the papers with care, as though weighing each word, considering every move. Finally, she pulled out a thin stack of documents, clutching them tightly, the edges pressed against her palm like a secret waiting to be revealed. She walked calmly to the podium, placing the papers on the table in front of her, and with a slow, measured motion, began to flip through the pages, her fingers grazing over each one. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then, just as she turned the final page, Naomi stopped. The silence in the courtroom felt almost suffocating. She lifted her gaze, first meeting Remington's, then slowly turning to face Judge Crawford. Her eyes were steady, cold, unflinching, and the room seemed to quiet even further in anticipation of what she would say next. "Your Honor," Naomi's voice broke the stillness, calm and clear, every word echoing through the chamber with perfect clarity. "There seems to be a small issue with this document." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, and for a split second, the entire courtroom seemed to freeze. There was a momentary flicker of confusion on the faces of the observers, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as everyone strained to comprehend what Naomi had just said. Several people leaned in, their curiosity piqued. Oliver Remington, however, was not one to show emotion easily, but even he couldn't hide a brief flash of surprise. His eyebrow arched just a fraction as he paused for a moment, then quickly masked it with a smooth, almost mocking smile. "Miss Carter," he drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "what exactly are you implying?" Naomi didn't answer right away. She remained composed, her fingers slowly turning the pages of the contract once more. Then, with a controlled motion, she gently turned the document around, placing her finger on a specific part of it. The atmosphere in the courtroom was suddenly suffocating, as if the very air had been drained from the room. Every eye in the space was locked on Naomi Carter and the stack of papers she had placed in front of her. The murmur from the crowd faded into nothingness, leaving a silence so thick that even the smallest sounds, such as a cough or a shuffle of feet, seemed to echo. The tension was so palpable, it was as if time itself had ground to a halt. The faint ticking of the clock in the corner became deafening. Naomi's movements were slow and deliberate, each one heightening the anticipation. She reached for the pen, her fingers steady despite the storm raging within the room. The sharp, metallic gleam of the pen reflected the cold, sterile light of the courtroom, making it appear almost dangerous in its stillness. She brought the pen to the document and hovered just above the signature at the bottom, her eyes never leaving Oliver Remington's. It was as if she was daring him to challenge her, daring him to stop her. "This signature," she said, her voice calm, but with an edge that sent chills through everyone present, "does not match any of the other documents submitted by the plaintiff." The words shattered the tense silence like a thunderclap, but it wasn't a loud explosion. It was an ominous crack in the foundation, the kind that makes the ground beneath your feet shift and tremble. The room fell into an eerie stillness, and even the most seasoned courtroom veterans could feel it, the sense that something monumental was happening. Naomi's words were met with complete silence for a heartbeat. Then a collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Some in the gallery gasped. Others shifted in their seats, trying to peer closer at the documents. One of the jurors, unable to hide his shock, furrowed his brow, and a court clerk shifted nervously, clearing their throat. The air was thick with anticipation, and for a moment, everyone forgot to breathe. Even Judge Crawford, who had been holding his pen as if it were a mere accessory, froze, his hand hanging suspended in midair. His gaze flickered from the papers to Naomi, then back to the contract, as if struggling to comprehend what had just been said. Oliver Remington's reaction was the most telling. For the briefest moment, his eyes widened, and his body stiffened. It was the look of someone who had just stepped into a trap they hadn't seen coming. But he quickly masked his unease with a practiced smile, one that was too practiced, too forced. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of tension creeping in, "you're not a handwriting expert." Naomi didn't rush to respond. Instead, she allowed the moment to linger. The stillness in the room was suffocating, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath, waiting for the next move. She slowly placed the pen down, her fingers grazing the edge of the desk. Then, with deliberate calm, she folded her hands in front of her and locked eyes with Remington. "I agree," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "I'm not a handwriting expert, but the forensic report I submitted to the court is." The room seemed to explode in that instant. Whispers erupted from the gallery, and a few gasps escaped from the jurors. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as if the weight of Naomi's words had physically struck them. A few jurors exchanged glances, their faces flushed with confusion and disbelief. Naomi wasn't just challenging the evidence. She was holding the very foundation of the case up to scrutiny, and she had the proof to back it up. Judge Crawford, who had appeared to be a silent spectator, now found himself caught off guard. He slowly removed his glasses, his fingers pressing against his temple, as if trying to focus. The courtroom felt like it was teetering on the edge of chaos. Even the most seasoned legal minds in the room couldn't deny it. Naomi had just thrown a grenade into this case, and no one knew what would happen next. Remington, once the epitome of composure, now seemed visibly shaken. He shifted in his seat, his hand unconsciously tightening around the edge of the table. The cocky, selfish, assured lawyer that had breezed through every case for years was now at a loss. Naomi Carter had just changed the entire game, and not with words alone, but with undeniable proof. The air in the courtroom became suffocating, as if an invisible weight had descended upon everyone. No one dared speak. No one dared move. All eyes were fixed on Naomi, who stood unmoving, as if daring anyone to challenge her. The courtroom was no longer just a place of legal proceedings. It was a battlefield, and Naomi Carter was standing on the front lines, ready to tear apart everything they thought they knew. Oliver Remington opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His mind raced, trying to come up with a counterargument, a way out of this. But for the first time in a long time, he found himself struggling to maintain control. Naomi's eyes locked onto him, unyielding and calm. She wasn't just a woman standing trial. She was a force, one that had just turned the tide in her favor. And in that moment, every person in the room, including Remington, understood the real battle had just begun. The tension in the courtroom thickened to a near unbearable degree, as if the very air was stretched taut with the weight of the impending confrontation. Oliver Remington sat frozen for a moment, his body rigid, as if every fiber of his being was fighting against what had just been unleashed. His jaw clenched so tightly, it was a miracle his teeth didn't snap. His fingers, once relaxed, were now digging into the edges of the documents, his knuckles white and trembling under the pressure. A fierce anger boiled up within him. This was not how this trial was supposed to go. He had played his part perfectly. He had built his case with care, backed by what he believed was airtight evidence. And yet here was Naomi Carter, standing before him with the confidence of a seasoned adversary, daring to question the validity of his carefully crafted work. A part of him almost couldn't believe it. Naomi Carter, this woman, had become the ultimate wild card in the trial. She had refused to cower under the pressure he had so expertly applied. She was calm, almost too calm, and that unnerved him more than anything else. Her unwavering composure, her refusal to break or stutter, had started to erode his confidence. This was not a meek woman hoping for a miracle. This was a force to be reckoned with, and Remington felt it in his gut. Throat tight, Remington fought to maintain control, his body stiff with barely contained frustration. But even as his mind raged, the tension in the room only continued to build. Naomi hadn't just defied him. She had exposed a vulnerability in him he had never expected to feel. For the first time, he questioned whether he had underestimated her from the beginning. Judge William Crawford, who had remained eerily silent throughout the standoff, banged his gavel down with a force that rattled the walls. The sound reverberated through the room, a sharp, authoritative command that forced everyone to refocus. Crawford's eyes, cold and sharp as steel, narrowed, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something unreadable in them. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low but cutting, "you really think a handwriting analysis is going to invalidate the plaintiff's evidence? You're going to risk the integrity of this entire case on this." Naomi remained completely still, her posture unyielding, her eyes locked onto Crawford without so much as a blink. She didn't flinch under his harsh tone. Instead, she stood her ground as though she were rooted to the very floor beneath her. Slowly, deliberately, she nodded once, her expression unchanged. "I believe in the truth, Your Honor." Her words hit like a lightning strike, quiet but carrying the weight of thunder. The calmness of her delivery only added to the impact, as though she were not simply speaking to the judge, but to everyone in the room. It wasn't a challenge, but the absolute certainty in her voice made every person present realize that she was not just hoping for a victory. She was prepared to take it. The silence in the courtroom became suffocating, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. Remington's mouth was dry, his throat constricting, his fingers trembled as they gripped the edge of the table. Naomi had just shifted the entire dynamic of the room. She wasn't asking for mercy or pleading for justice. She was staking her claim. She was forcing everyone to reckon with the truth, and that made her an entirely new kind of threat. Remington recovered from his initial shock, though only just. He let out a harsh, dry laugh, one that was as much to convince himself as it was to challenge Naomi. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low and dripping with condescension, "I'll give you credit. You're brave. I'll give you that." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he measured his words. "But bravery cannot replace valid legal evidence, and you should know that." Naomi's gaze never wavered. She didn't so much as blink, her stare cutting into him with surgical precision. She didn't answer immediately, letting the weight of her silence settle over the room, her very stillness making the air feel heavier. Then, slowly, deliberately, she placed both hands on the table, her fingers lightly touching the surface as she leaned in just slightly. Her voice, when it came, was deliberate, unwavering, and chillingly calm. "Then let the evidence speak for itself." The room felt as though it had been plunged into ice-cold water. Remington's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, a cold shiver ran down his spine, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. This was not just a courtroom battle anymore. This was personal. Naomi Carter had not only exposed a flaw in his case, but she had also taken control of the trial. He had expected her to break under the weight of his arguments. He had expected her to crumble. But instead, she had done the unthinkable. She had turned the tables, and now the ball was firmly in her court. Remington's hand clenched so tightly around the documents that the edges of the paper started to crinkle under his grip. His mind raced, trying to figure out a way to regain control, to strike back, to pull the rug out from under Naomi before she could finish her move. But for the first time in his career, he felt the weight of his arrogance pushing back against him. Naomi had leveled the playing field, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could regain the advantage. The room was now so thick with tension that it felt as if the very walls were closing in. No one dared speak. No one dared breathe too loudly. Every person in the room, from the jurors to the clerks, was waiting for the next move in a game they suddenly weren't sure they understood. Naomi Carter was no longer just a defendant. She was a force. And as the room held its breath, Oliver Remington found himself facing not just a woman on trial, but a true adversary who had just turned everything he thought he knew upside down. Judge William Crawford took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure, but a simmering frustration was rising in his chest. He had handled countless cases, witnessed hundreds of defendants trembling, begging for mercy, or, worse, panicking to the point of sabotaging their last chance. But Naomi Carter was completely different. Crawford narrowed his eyes, staring at the woman standing at the podium. She wasn't arguing for the sake of arguing. She didn't raise her voice to draw attention, nor did she attempt to elicit sympathy or provoke the jury's emotions. She simply presented each argument with razor-sharp precision, cold and calm, every word as if it had been etched into her memory. It made Crawford uneasy. On the other side, Oliver Remington was beginning to sense the disturbance in the air. He tried to hide the growing unease in his mind, but his sharp eyes couldn't ignore the unfolding events. Naomi was offering no openings, no sign that she was being overwhelmed. In fact, she seemed to be in complete control. Remington clenched his jaw tightly. He was used to controlling the courtroom, making his opponents fumble, digging into their weaknesses, and forcing them to make mistakes. But now, Naomi wasn't making mistakes. She was too calm, too prepared, and that was shifting the entire atmosphere in the courtroom. Judge Crawford flipped through the case files before him, but his gaze no longer carried the same confident assurance it had before. An odd feeling crept into his thoughts, an unsettling sense that something was off. He looked down at his hand and realized, unconsciously, he had gripped the pen so tightly that the nib had imprinted itself into the paper beneath. Crawford looked up, his gaze locking onto Naomi. "Miss Carter, do you realize that if you fail to prove this legally, you will only put yourself at a severe disadvantage?" Naomi didn't flinch. She slowly tilted her head, her dark eyes gleaming with a sharp intensity. "Your Honor, I am fully aware of that." There was a pause, and then she spoke again, her tone soft but unwavering. "But I am also aware that the truth cannot be changed just because someone refuses to accept it." The room seemed to stop. Her words weren't confrontational, but they were enough to make a few people in the gallery glance at each other. Remington felt a chill run down his spine. He had a gut feeling that Naomi Carter was not your average defendant, and if he didn't find a way to regain control of this situation, this could very well be the first time in his career that he lost control of a trial. After the lunch break, the atmosphere in the courtroom felt strangely subdued. The hum of whispered conversations had died down, leaving only the occasional murmur, as if everyone in the room could sense that something unusual was unfolding. Oliver Remington entered with his usual calm demeanor, but his sharp eyes flicked repeatedly toward Naomi, as if he were trying to unravel the layers of mystery surrounding her. Meanwhile, Judge Crawford, having just returned to his seat, was approached hastily by a court clerk who bent down to whisper something into his ear. As the words reached Crawford, his face momentarily stiffened. His eyes widened in surprise. For a fleeting instant, an expression so rare that he couldn't quite hide it appeared. His hand, which had been casually holding his pen, now gripped it tightly, as if he had just received news he could hardly believe. He blinked once, then twice, as if trying to ensure he hadn't misunderstood. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he turned his gaze toward Naomi Carter. His look no longer held the usual disdain, but rather a mixture of suspicion and, just for a moment, a trace of concern. She wasn't just a regular defendant, not some helpless figure clinging to a faint hope, not an easy target for Remington to crush. No, she was something entirely different, someone he should have recognized from the beginning, someone who shouldn't have been underestimated. Naomi Carter was a lawyer, a legal genius, someone who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with the best in the field. And she wasn't here simply to defend herself. She was here to attack. Crawford slowly placed the pen down on the table, his posture straightening slightly, as though trying to regain control over himself. But inside, a strange feeling was creeping in. Was it confusion, frustration, or perhaps the unsettling realization that he had made a serious misstep? He had mocked someone he should have been wary of. He had dismissed a person with enough skill to stand toe-to-toe with Remington in his own courtroom. Remington, still oblivious to the source of the shift in atmosphere, noticed the brief flicker of warning in Crawford's eyes as the judge turned to him. It was as if something had changed. Remington frowned, for the first time during this trial feeling somewhat disoriented. He glanced at Naomi, but this time his gaze was different, not with the usual smug certainty, but with a genuine question in his eyes. Who is she really? Naomi remained seated, but her body language spoke volumes. The way she had her arms crossed, the slight tilt of her head as she observed the reactions around her made it clear that she was fully in control of the situation. She knew that her secret had finally been exposed, but she didn't flinch, didn't seem surprised, and there was no hint of someone who had just been uncovered. On the contrary, she appeared to be enjoying the moment. She looked at Remington, then at Crawford, and a small, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips, a smile that sent a shiver down Remington's spine for the first time that day. Because this was no longer a rigged trial. This had become a real game of chess, and Naomi Carter was holding the strongest piece on the board. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically, as if the very air had turned heavy with uncertainty and tension. Just moments earlier, Judge William Crawford had been confident, fully believing that he was guiding the trial along the well-worn path he had walked hundreds of times. He had accepted Oliver Remington's eloquent arguments, reviewed the plaintiff's evidence with the same detached professionalism he had always relied on, and was ready to close the case with the kind of finality that came with years of experience. He was certain that everything would proceed as it always had, orderly, predictable, and within his control. But now, every corner of the room seemed to pulse with a sense of impending change. Crawford's confidence was slipping, and the foundation he had carefully constructed beneath his feet began to crack. He looked at Remington, but where once he had seen a calm, confident figure, there was now a man whose composure was beginning to falter. Remington's hand, which had been so relaxed on the table, was now clenched tightly. His fingers digging into the wood were a subtle sign of the unease that had begun to take root in his mind. His sharp eyes were fixed on Naomi Carter, but there was no longer a challenge in his gaze. Instead, it was filled with suspicion, weariness, and, most unsettlingly, doubt. Remington was analyzing the situation, desperately searching for a weakness to exploit, but Naomi was as unyielding as a stone wall. There was no opening, no chink in her armor. Naomi stood tall, unmoving, her piercing gaze sweeping over the room. She didn't need to dominate the space with loud words or grand gestures. Her mere presence, her silence, commanded attention. She spoke, and every word she uttered carried the weight of 1,000 carefully considered thoughts. The handwriting analysis report has clearly identified that the signature on the contract is forged, she said, her voice cutting through the silence with unnerving clarity. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The courtroom was deathly quiet, every eye focused intently on her. Naomi didn't pause for dramatic effect. She let the words settle, the full weight of the accusation lingering in the air. She glanced at Remington, her eyes sharp and calculating, before turning her gaze to Judge Crawford. But that's not the only irregularity, she added, her voice steady, but with an underlying power that shook the air around them. The tension in the room intensified. It wasn't just the revelation of a forged signature, it was the way Naomi had said it. She wasn't just pointing out a flaw in the case, she was dismantling it piece by piece. It was as if she had been waiting for this very moment, knowing exactly how the pieces would fall into place. Crawford felt the familiar sense of control he had so easily wielded slip further from his grasp. He had dealt with desperate defendants before, people who crumbled under pressure, who panicked and made mistakes. But Naomi Carter was different. She was unshaken, unflappable. There was no sign of fear or uncertainty in her. She was methodical, deliberate. She wasn't just here to defend herself. She was here to win. And she was doing it with an eerie calmness that made everything she said feel like an inevitable conclusion. Naomi continued, her voice now steady and firm with an undeniable edge of authority. The financial documents of the plaintiff contain another anomaly. Immediately after the sales contract was signed, a significant sum of money was transferred into a third-party account, one that has no known connection to the transaction. She laid another set of documents on the table, tapping them lightly with her finger, her gaze never leaving Crawford or Remington. And according to my investigation, this third party is involved in a network of suspicious financial transactions, including the sale of certain assets under highly opaque and questionable circumstances. The room seemed to implode in shock. The air was thick with disbelief, the walls closing in as the reality of Naomi's words began to settle in. It wasn't just a challenge to the plaintiff's case anymore. It was a revelation of something far larger, something far more dangerous, a fraud of a scale that no one had seen coming. Naomi Carter hadn't just torn apart the foundation of the plaintiff's arguments. She had unveiled an entire criminal network. Remington's face went pale. His mouth opened and closed as though he were trying to find the right words, but none came. He had become rigid in his seat, his body tense with the realization that Naomi Carter had just flipped the script. Everything he had believed, every ounce of his confidence, was unraveling before him. The sense of control he had spent years cultivating was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Judge Crawford's heartbeat quickened, but not from anger. It was something else, something foreign. It was the feeling of someone realizing they had made a grievous mistake, of placing their trust in the wrong hands. He looked at Remington again, this time with more than just disappointment. He saw panic in the man's eyes, true panic. For the first time, Remington's carefully constructed exterior was cracking, revealing the vulnerability beneath. It was a crack that couldn't be patched up with words, no matter how sharp or eloquent. Crawford knew without a doubt that Naomi had just irrevocably changed the game. He could feel the heat rising in his chest. And it wasn't anger. It was the gnawing sensation of someone who had allowed their ego and complacency to cloud their judgment. He had underestimated Naomi Carter. He had mocked her, believed her to be just another desperate, naive defendant. And now, as the truth unfolded before him, he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Naomi Carter wasn't just a lawyer. She was a mastermind, and she had been playing this game from the very beginning. As the realization settled in, Crawford felt the weight of the situation bear down on him. He had lost control. He had underestimated her. And now, there was no turning back. Remington had yet to react, his mind racing to catch up with the revelations Naomi had just laid bare. But Crawford knew he had lost the upper hand. Naomi Carter had taken the reins of this trial, and there was nothing left for him or Remington to do but watch as she dismantled everything they had built. The courtroom was no longer a battlefield. It was Naomi Carter's arena, and she had just executed the perfect checkmate. The atmosphere in the courtroom was no longer just tense. It was so thick with anticipation that it felt suffocating. The room seemed to hold its breath, as though everyone inside was caught in a moment of suspended disbelief. No one dared exhale too loudly, and no one made the slightest movement. Naomi Carter stood at the very center of it all, unwavering, holding an old but still well-preserved file. The papers, yellowed with time, seemed to hold secrets and truths far more valuable than their aged appearance suggested. She placed the file down in front of Judge Crawford with a quiet, decisive motion. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, stayed fixed on him, as if daring him to challenge the truth she was about to reveal. "This is the official copy of my father's will, Robert Carter's." Naomi's voice rang out, cutting through the thick silence like a razor-sharp blade. "This document has been legally authenticated and is securely stored in the notary's office. It clearly states that I am the sole heir to the property in dispute in this lawsuit." The room froze, as if the very air had been sucked out of it. A collective gasp echoed softly through the gallery, the weight of Naomi's words sinking in with stunning clarity. Remington, who had always worn his calm, confident demeanor like armor, now sat frozen, his eyes wide with shock. His entire body stiffened, his mind racing in disbelief. No, this couldn't be happening. He had reviewed every document, checked every record. How could he have overlooked something so crucial? Across the room, in the plaintiff's section, Charles Whitmore, the man who had masterminded this entire legal battle, was now as pale as a ghost. His face drained of color, his lips parted as though trying to find words, but none came. His hands, once so assured as they rested on the table, now clenched tightly together, his knuckles turning white with the force of his grip. His eyes darted around the room frantically, as if searching for some way out, some shred of hope, but there was no escape. The walls of his carefully constructed case had just crumbled. Judge Crawford, who had always been the calm, controlling presence in the courtroom, was now feeling the weight of the moment. He had spent years presiding over trials, knowing how to steer each case, how to dismiss the weak arguments, how to close each case with authority. But this was different. The very foundation of his control was being shaken, and for the first time in his long career, he felt a deep unease. He picked up the file, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as he flipped through the pages. His eyes scanned each line, his brows furrowing deeper with each passing moment. The more he read, the clearer it became. Naomi's claim was legitimate. The document was official. The will was genuine. There was no way to deny it. It was all right there in front of him, laid bare for everyone to see. He sighed deeply, his breath heavy and reluctant. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind, and a feeling of confusion began to rise within him. He had misjudged Naomi Carter. In his arrogance, he had dismissed her as just another desperate defendant, someone he could easily dismiss, someone who would crumble under the weight of his power. But now he realized the truth. She was far more than that. She wasn't just defending her property. She was dismantling his entire case, exposing the lies and manipulation beneath it all. And in that moment, he felt a cold realization. He had been wrong. He raised his gavel, the sound of it slicing through the room louder than it had ever been before. Silence in the courtroom. His voice rang out, deep and commanding, making the room tremble. The sound of the gavel slamming onto the desk echoed across the courtroom, signaling the end of the battle, the end of the fight. Judge Crawford looked at Remington, his gaze piercing, filled with a mixture of disbelief and authority. Then he turned to Whitmore. "Do you have anything to say, Mr. Whitmore?" he asked, his voice now colder than ever, laced with an unmistakable edge of accusation. Whitmore opened his mouth, trying to speak, but no words came. His lips moved, but all that escaped was a stammering gasp. He had no defense left. Naomi Carter had just torn through the facade of his case, shattering the illusion he had built. He knew without a doubt that everything was over. His hands, still clenched in an attempt to maintain control, betrayed him. The truth had come to light, and there was no denying it. Naomi had won. She had exposed his lies, his schemes, and now there was nothing left to do but face the consequences. Remington, who had been the rock of the plaintiff's case, still hadn't spoken. He sat there motionless, staring ahead, his mind spinning with disbelief. He had always been in control, always the one who dictated the terms of the trial. But now, for the first time in his career, he felt powerless. Naomi Carter had outplayed him. She had dismantled everything he had worked so hard to build, and there was nothing left for him to do but accept the crushing weight of his failure. His fist clenched around the edge of the table, his knuckles white with frustration and anger. His eyes darkened with a mix of bitterness and disbelief, his mind still trying to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. Naomi stood at the center of it all, calm and composed. Her gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of each person in the courtroom. There was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet, undeniable certainty. She had done what she came here to do. She had not only defended her property, but had also exposed the fraud, the deceit, and the corruption at the heart of this case. For the first time in what felt like forever, the balance of power had shifted. Naomi Carter wasn't just a defendant anymore. She had become the victor, the one who had rewritten the rules of the game. And as she stood there, her hands steady, her voice calm, the reality of her triumph was undeniable. In that moment, the courtroom knew Naomi Carter had just completely changed the course of this trial, and perhaps the entire game. The courtroom was shrouded in an eerie silence after Judge William Crawford delivered his ruling. For a moment, it felt as though the very air had thickened, frozen in time, awaiting the next move. But soon, the silence began to crack. Whispers spread like wildfire, hushed but urgent, as if every person in the room was trying to process what had just unfolded. None of them, not even the most experienced attorneys, could have anticipated this outcome. Naomi Carter, a woman who had entered the courtroom seemingly out of place, her simple appearance mocked from the very beginning, had shattered the expectations of everyone present. With nothing but her intelligence and impeccable preparation, she had unraveled the case with precision, turning everything on its head. And now she had done the unthinkable. She had defeated Oliver Remington, the man who had been invincible in the legal world for years. Judge Crawford leaned forward, resting his hands on the table as he glanced around the room. His eyes were no longer sharp with the confidence they had held at the start of the trial. Instead, they betrayed a flicker of doubt, a recognition that he had missed something significant. He had misjudged Naomi Carter, underestimated her from the start. He had thought her just another desperate defendant, someone who would crumble under the weight of his authority. But he was wrong. His mistake had been assuming this trial would follow the usual path, one he had walked countless times. He had failed to account for the unexpected, Naomi Carter's brilliance. At the plaintiff's table, Oliver Remington remained motionless. He didn't sit down, nor did he rise. He was a man suspended in disbelief, unable to process what had just happened. His lips parted, but the words he had prepared seemed to catch in his throat, too heavy to utter. His fingers gripped the edge of the table with such force that his knuckles turned white. For the first time in years, Remington was lost for words. He had become a man undone by his own arrogance, left to confront an outcome that had shattered his carefully constructed world. Charles Whitmore, the man behind this entire lawsuit, sat completely still. His face had turned ghostly pale, as though the blood had drained from his body. He gripped his hands together so tightly that the joints of his fingers popped white with tension. But no matter how much he tried to steady himself, the fear was visible in every line of his face. This was not just about losing a property he had once thought he could claim easily. This was far more significant than that. Naomi Carter hadn't simply defended herself. She had exposed everything, leaving Whitmore with nowhere to hide. Naomi stood tall at the center of the room. She took a deep, measured breath and slowly exhaled, the weight of the moment settling into her bones. She didn't smile with victory, nor did she allow herself any show of triumph. There was no gloating, no haughty gestures. But in her gaze, there was an undeniable strength, an unwavering certainty. Naomi Carter was a woman who had not only fought for justice, but had won it with nothing but her mind and her resolve. She was not a victim in this courtroom. She was a force, and everyone in the room could now see it. Judge Crawford raised his gavel once more, and as it struck the desk, the sound reverberated through the courtroom, not just as the finality of a trial, but as the undeniable marking of a victory that could not be reversed. "This trial is concluded," he declared, his voice loud and final, but with an undertone of something more, perhaps respect for Naomi Carter, perhaps acknowledgement of the victory that had just been claimed. The room, once filled with tension, now buzzed with voices. Lawyers exchanged whispers, some barely able to comprehend what had just unfolded. A few younger attorneys turned to one another, their eyes wide with shock, trying to piece together how Naomi had turned everything upside down. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks, preparing to write the story of a lifetime. But Naomi Carter was not focused on them. She wasn't concerned with the whispers or the article that would soon appear in the papers. She stood still, looking straight ahead, her posture as unyielding as ever. For the first time in many years, Naomi Carter had secured the truth, and that truth had brought her the justice she had long fought for. As she turned to leave the courtroom, the eyes that followed her were no longer filled with mockery or doubt. There was no scorn left in the gazes that lingered on her. Instead, they were filled with admiration, a quiet, growing respect for the woman who had walked into a courtroom prepared to fight a system that had written her off and emerged victorious. She had done what no one thought was possible. She had changed the entire course of the trial with nothing but her intelligence, her determination, and her unshakable belief in justice. For Naomi, there was no need for celebration. There was only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had not only defended her property, but she had exposed the deception at the heart of the case. As she walked out of the courtroom, her head held high, she knew this was just the beginning. She had won this battle, but there were more fights ahead, ones that would require just as much strength, just as much determination. And Naomi Carter was ready for them all. Naomi Carter stepped out of the courtroom, the soft tap of her low heels against the hard floor echoing in the quiet hallway. The air outside was a stark contrast to the suffocating tension that had filled the courtroom only minutes earlier. Everything now seemed lighter, though beneath that calm surface, there were still waves of thoughts and emotions swirling within her. A few people observed her from a distance, their gazes no longer filled with mockery or disdain, but with surprise and even respect. Naomi didn't look back. She had spent far too many years of her life living under the scrutiny of others, being judged for who she was and what she looked like. Today, she didn't need anyone to acknowledge her victory. Justice had been served, and that was the only thing that mattered. But before she could go any further, a familiar voice called out from behind. "Miss Carter." Naomi paused. She didn't rush to turn around, but she could feel the weight of the gaze behind her. When she finally turned, Judge William Crawford was standing there. His eyes, which had once carried a cold, authoritative sharpness from his seat on the bench, now held something different, something that was rarely seen from him. A vulnerability, perhaps, or a sense of humility. He inhaled softly, as though carefully choosing his words before speaking. "I misjudged you," he said, his voice deeper, lacking the mockery or indifference he had shown in court. For the first time, there was an unmistakable acknowledgement in his eyes. Naomi met his gaze steadily. A second passed, then two. She could say so many things right now about the injustice, the prejudice, about how he and people like him had looked down on her. But she didn't need to. The truth had already spoken for itself. "Not just me, but many others," she replied, her tone cool, unwavering, free of anger or sarcasm. "I hope you don't make that mistake again." Crawford didn't respond right away. He stood there, seemingly lost in thought, reflecting on the weight of her words. A light breeze drifted through the corridor, carrying with it the faintest hint of change, small but undeniable. Naomi didn't wait for his reply. She turned away and continued walking, leaving behind a man who, for the first time in many years, had to face the mistake he had made. Naomi Carter stepped out of the grand doors of the courthouse, and immediately, the warm sunlight kissed her face, washing away the tension that had built up inside her over the past days. The sun felt like a long-lost friend after the suffocating weight of the courtroom. She closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the simple act of breathing freely, free from the endless scrutiny, free from the pressure of the trial that had loomed over her every move. The world outside was quiet in its own way, but it was different from the tense silence that had settled in the courtroom. Here, the air felt open, vast with possibilities. The steps leading down from the courthouse seemed like a metaphor for what she had just overcome. She had ascended them with little more than the determination to right a wrong, and now, as she descended them, it felt as though she was stepping into a new chapter of her life. The weight of victory settled comfortably in her chest, but it wasn't a feeling of finality. She knew deep down that today was not just about reclaiming what was hers. It was a statement to the world, a statement that justice could be won even when the odds seemed impossible, a statement that anyone, regardless of who they were, could stand tall in the face of injustice. Naomi hadn't only fought for her property. She had fought for something far more important, a truth that many had wanted to keep buried. That truth was simple, yet revolutionary. Justice didn't belong to the wealthy or the powerful. It belonged to those who dared to stand up for what was right. It was for the ones who fought with everything they had, even when the system seemed rigged against them. And today, Naomi had proven without a shadow of a doubt that even a single individual could make a difference. She had fought for herself, yes, but she had also fought for every person who had been overlooked, discarded, or silenced simply because of where they came from, the color of their skin, or the social status they had, or rather, the lack of it. Her victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt invisible, ignored, or underestimated. Today, Naomi Carter had not just won a case in court. She had sent a message to the world. That message would resonate far beyond the confines of the courthouse. On the sidewalk, reporters were already gathering, cameras snapping, their flashes lighting up the air around her. The hustle of their voices filled the space as they rushed to ask her what she felt after this monumental victory. Naomi paused for just a moment, taking in the scene, but she didn't rush to speak. She knew what she had accomplished, and she knew what the world would soon realize. She didn't need to boast or make a grand statement. Her actions had already done the talking. She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, a quiet acknowledgement of everything she had been through and everything she had achieved. She wasn't gloating. There was no sense of vindication in her expression. She had come this far not for personal satisfaction, but for something much greater. She had done what many thought was impossible, and just as she had known all along, it wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. Could societal prejudices be shattered easily? No. Naomi knew that the path toward true equality was long, and it was filled with obstacles that no single person could overcome alone. But she was more certain than ever that small victories like hers could ripple out into the world, creating waves of change that were powerful enough to dismantle the systems of oppression one piece at a time. She wasn't naive. She understood that the work ahead would be hard and relentless, but that wouldn't stop her. It never had. She had already proven something powerful today. that one person standing alone could defy the odds and change the course of history. Naomi Carter had shown that the power of determination, intelligence, and a strong sense of justice was far more formidable than any of the barriers designed to keep people like her down. She knew that today's victory would inspire others to rise up, to fight for their own rights, and to demand the justice they deserved. As Naomi walked away from the courthouse, the hum of the city surrounding her, she noticed something different in the eyes of those who watched her pass by. There was no longer any mockery or judgment. Instead, there was admiration, a quiet, unspoken respect. For the first time in her life, Naomi wasn't just the woman who had been underestimated. She was the woman who had changed the game. The world had seen her for who she truly was, and they respected her for it. The world was watching now, and Naomi Carter was not finished, not by a long shot. She had taken on the system and won, but there were still so many others out there, still so many battles to fight. She would not stop here, not when there was still so much to be done. Do you think societal prejudices can be easily broken? Can Naomi's victory spark a larger movement, or will she face even bigger challenges ahead? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep up with more stories of triumph, resilience, and change. The journey is far from over.